Welcome, everyone, to the Punch Bowl. Welcome to the Punch Bowl. I'm so pleased that you all are here. My name is Hannah Zimmerman. I'm the marketing director at Locust Grove and also your woman behind the technical curtain. We're going to be using the chat today to ask questions of our panelists, so you can let us know where you are, what you're drinking, and what you're excited about. We're so pleased to have Fawn Weaver and Andrea Meriwether join our usual panelists of Steve, Alan, and Brian today. And with that, I will let Brian Cushing, the program director at Locust Grove, take it away. Brian?
Thank you, Hannah, and welcome everybody to our fourth installment of the Punch Bowl. This has been going really well, and we've touched on this topic in every episode so far, and this is going to be a completely dedicated episode to the history of African Americans in distilling. And we've got with us today Andrea Meriwether, who's a great Locust Grove partner who you'll recognize, and Fawn Weaver, who I've been wanting to meet for years, and a pandemic finally brought us together in the same space. So welcome everybody. The Punch Bowl is an aspect of the Odyssey Project. And the Odyssey Project was conceived by Brian Austin, Colonial Williamsburg, and Hannah Zimmerman, who you just met from Locust Grove here. And it was as we were all kind of navigating this way of how we're going to bring history to people in the remote age of COVID, and they kind of got together and talked about this idea of, you know, we can partner sites in the East and then what in the 18th and early 19th century was the West in a way that we couldn't before, and really talk about what this movement from East to West meant, what changed, what stayed the same. And so that's kind of the broader idea of the Odyssey Project, to bring all these different kinds of institutions and organizations together virtually to bring that world to life, to explore that world. So the Punch Bowl is the first of these programs to kick off. Again, we're in our fourth installment. It's going great. But we started talking about alcohol and distilling and things like that. And so we started talking about regions. And so the first couple ones we did, we got two eastern sites together, two western sites. We had Mount Vernon and West Overton, and we had Locust Grove and Spirits of French Lick up in Indiana. And so that's what led us here today. A reminder to ask questions through the chat, keep microphones muted. And with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. You already recognize us guys. My name is Brian Cushing. I'm the program director at Locust Grove. I work closely with the Small Farm Distillery Project at Locust Grove. Steve Bashore is Master Distiller, Master Miller, and Director of Historic Trades at Mount Vernon. Alan Bishop is Master Distiller and just general spirits historian and guru up there at Spirits of French Lick, and he works with us at Locust Grove quite a bit, and we have a blast doing that. Andrea Meriwether, who, if you've been around Locust Grove's programming lately, or if you've been around us in general, you probably recognize her. Sharing the spirit of the Kentucky hug with others through experiential food and beverage curations is how Andrea D. Meriwether shares her bourbon roots with the world. By strategically pairing bourbon and Southern-inspired cuisine with a pinch of panache and storytelling, Andrea has developed a model that engages audiences and empowers enthusiasts and consumers to explore like a tourist while eating and drinking like a taste master. Believing that food and beverage are the social agents making America great again, bringing unlikely people together one sip and bite at a time. A 2019 Gentleman Jack Spirited Woman of Influence honoree, Andrea advocates for the equity and inclusion of women and people of color in the food and beverage space. As a consultant, Andrea also helps travel, food, and drink brands develop world-class experiential history-infused experiences through her hospitality consulting business, Barfare Concepts. She also serves on advisory roles to the Black Tourism Advisory Council for Louisville Tourism, the Mayor's Bourbonism Steering Committee, and the Kentucky Distillers Association DEI panel. Andrea is committed to diversifying the spirits industry through workforce development, supplier diversity, and preserving the history of creators of color within the bourbon and hospitality industry. So welcome back with us, Andrea. And it is now my extreme pleasure to introduce for the first time here with us at Locust Grove, Fawn Weaver. Fawn has been a serial entrepreneur for nearly 25 years. As the CEO and founder of Grant Sidney Inc., GSI, a family-owned private investment company, Weaver has often been active in her investments, serving in leadership capacities behind the scenes. She also serves as the CEO of Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, a company she founded in 2016, which sits under the GSI umbrella. Weaver is a USA Today and New York Times best-selling author who has appeared on hundreds of popular radio, morning, and television talk shows across the US, including CBS This Morning, Fox Business, The Today Show, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune. She has also been interviewed by top shows in Canada, United Kingdom, South Africa, Italy, Belgium, Ireland, Australia, Poland, Spain, and New Zealand. Weaver launched her first company, a public relations and special events firm, in 1996. In addition to her firm, from 1990 funding and was business manager for the first 4 years. Taking a 6-year break from entrepreneurism to learn what it was like to be the employee rather than the employer, Weaver held a variety of positions in the hospitality industry. She worked as the head of special events and catering for the world-famous Viceroy Hotels in Santa Monica and as a general manager for a Dimension Development Company, the operator of more than 50 Marriott and Hilton brand hotels throughout the U.S. The experience profoundly changed how we full scholarships to every descendant of Nearest Green, the first known African-American master distiller who is honored through Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey. Through their Operation Brothers Keeper initiative, the foundation supplied more than 300,000 N95 and cloth masks to workers on the front line and people in disadvantaged communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, in response to the BLM movement, the foundation formed the alliance with Jack Daniel's Distillery to create the Nearest and Jack Advancement Initiative to elevate people of color within the American whiskey industry and to greatly increase diversity in the spirit industry overall. So thank you both very much for being with us. Those are some impressive accomplishments.
I have never had anyone read the whole bio.
It was also good. I couldn't figure out what to leave out.
So long.
So what are we drinking tonight, folks? It's happy hour.
Woo.
I
always pour a shot of whiskey in my coffee. It's my way of cutting calories. So it's the way I enjoy it, neat and black.
That's hilarious. I'm drinking Uncle Nearest 1820, and I'm drinking it neat.
Excellent. Anybody else?
I've got our brand new Lee W. Sinclair bottled and bond, and that is actually currently going into some fresh pressed cider that we made last week. So.
Ooh, can you put that bottle closer to the camera?
Yeah.
Ooh, that looks fantastic. All right.
Thank you.
Steve, you got anything?
A little bit of our recent apple brandy. This is a lab sample bottle, so as they say, not for human consumption, I guess, but it is. It's at barrel proof, so I always keep a little back at barrel proof.
Wow.
Well, this is something I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to find again, but it's a little bit topical. This is one of Low Gap's clear products, and I like it because this particular one, this isn't the rye. This is the corn malted oat and malted rye, and I like this because it's somewhat vaguely similar to what was probably going into the Locust Grove whiskey almost 200 years ago. It's in its white form, which their whiskey was 200 years ago. This is the best white whiskey I ever have had. I love it. Like I say, I'm afraid it's going away, though. I can't really find it anymore. But that is part of African-American history and distilling, is distilling at Locust Grove. Our distillers were enslaved African-Americans, and that's how Andrea first came to us with a question about, what we were doing down there and what it was about. So take us away with some thoughts, Andrea.
So yes, thank you, Historic Locust Grove, and everyone for having me this evening. So my journey to Locust Grove was really accidental. I was commissioned to do another project, and in my research, I came across a land document showing that there was a mill and a still on the site. Then running across farm letters about enslaved that were exchanged between the property, women that would have been crop processing. We actually have a name now of a gentleman that would have been distilling at Locust Grove. And my curiosity just said, sit down with the team at Locust Grove and see how we can build this story and this narrative into the programming so that we gear it towards expanding our audience, that we present a different perspective on American whiskey distilling, and that we just begin to build a descendant community, which was really lacking at the historic property as well. So it's just been a very fruitful relationship. Actually, the day I held my first lecture at Historic Locust Grove, a descendant of the property reached out to me on Facebook. And that was us identifying our first actual descendant for the community that we're building from the enslaved at Historic Locust Grove. And from there, it's growing. More people are continuing to reach out. We are building that descendant community and exchanging history. Heather Kleisner had started a lot of the research at Historic Locust Grove, and I came with missing parts that she didn't have. And really that's what it's been like, putting together a puzzle. And it's really been taking everyone working together collaboratively so that, again, we can create narratives that include everyone in all parts of history, because African American history, the narratives of the enslaved, that's all American history.
And I want to say too, a lot of people say they're interested when they show up, and most of them are. But Andrea is the first one who I've ever known that literally we walked around, we talked like late morning, early afternoon. She went back to the library and hit the books until I literally had to set the alarm on blowing. So that's when you know somebody's serious at that point.
Yes, and I mean, I just loved how inviting and how warm everyone was at Locust Grove. I was really afraid initially. I was like, I don't know what they're going to think about what I have to say or the things that I found. And they were like, this is great. Let's do more together. Let's figure this out. And I think that that's the first part with a lot of this work. We've got to get over those fears, apprehensions, and the what ifs. My theme for the year has been be brave in everything that we do when it comes to this work of bridging gaps and building community, that we would all be brave in what we bring to the table.
So Fawn, what brought you here to this place?
Well, that's a loaded question, but I'd say that the easiest and shortest answer is I was chasing the story of the first known African American master distiller. Now I understand that Andrea just uncovered a name, right? Is that right? At Locust Grove? Is that accurate?
We do have a name. Yeah, his
Okay.
he was popped up as a miller living at the mill where we presumed that the distillery also was. They call him Old Uncle Jim.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought you guys had uncovered a distiller's name, no?
Well, we think he was also the distiller after conversation. Yeah, with Andrea and Steve and Alan, we all kind of shot messages back and forth, looked at this evidence. Alan especially had some specific instances where, and he can maybe fill in this, but where millers were also distillers in that context.
Got it. And I think Steve, you have now the name, right, as well, of the distiller that was there, that was African American?
Well, there were 6.
And they
Yeah, and you know, I've got a little bit of our reports here, but we had James, Hanson, Peter, Nat, Daniel, and Timothy are listed as distillers. You also have James Anderson's son, John, who's a Scot, who's the manager. And he had an assistant distiller. So basically 8 men, 6 being African American, they were working that building.
do we know any of their last names? Because you were able to find some descendants or no?
Well, we do know 2 or 3 last names. One in particular didn't work at the distillery, but the last name of Quander is, and we have known descendants. In fact, it's an interesting full circle story in that a few years ago, the head of the Mount Vernon Inn, which is our restaurant, was Jay Quander, whose ancestors were enslaved at Mount Vernon. And he, here it is full circle where he's running our whole dining operation. And so at our museum, a number of descendant families we have on video in our main gallery. One of our main galleries is a exhibit called Lives Bound Together, which tells the story of the entire slave community at Mount Vernon. And so part of that is objects and histories, but also these families we could connect back all the way.
Were you able to connect back with any of the distillers?
Not yet.
Okay.
No. And
But
as
you're
you know,
working on it.
yeah, as you know, we're always doing research, but one of the difficult things for African American families is that at some point you reach a crossroads where records don't exist, or there's a break, or people got sold into another part of the country, and so the history is arrested. That's what is so interesting about how you found out what you did, find out about Nearest, to connect the dots, because as Andrea said, really it's detective work.
Mm-hmm.
History is detective work. Alan does it so much in various aspects. Brian's fantastic at it. And I've heard you tell the story 2 or 3 times about Nearest and all you went through to piece it together. And then a light bulb goes off when 2 pieces of information connect.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've kind of bridged a gap. And so we're always looking to bridge the gaps. We're always, we have voluminous records. We do know what's really interesting, I think, we do know the family relationships of all the slaves at Mount Vernon, who was married to who their children were, what farm they lived on. And then to a pretty good degree, we know what happened to them after Washington died. But, you know, there's a lot of loose ends to always try to, you know, reconnect with.
Yeah, I mean, I still have historians and conservators on this every single day, because I still think there's quite a bit more. There's still holes that at the top of his life, at the end of his life, that I still haven't been able to uncover. And you're talking about, you know, more than 2,500 hours and 20 different historians, archaeologists, genealogists, and archivists, and all the rest of that. Just in the first 1.5 to 2 years, I've not calculated the number of hours since that point. And so, but to answer your question, Brian, I followed the story of Nearest Green after seeing 2 things in the New York Times. I was in Singapore. It was on the cover of the New York Times International Edition. And the headline was, Jack Daniel embraces a secret ingredient, help from a slave. And the headline enough was pretty jarring, as at that time I was going into my 40th year of living, and I can say without question that up until that point there was no American brand that I was familiar with that was at least a century old, that had not that where we could actually say there was an African American that was at the beginning of that was integral as a part of it, and we could name them. Now, granted, the article had his name spelled wrong, but it had enough information, and there was an actual descendant whose picture was in there. Now, I've done their whole family tree at this point. He's not actually a descendant. However, at the time, that was the thought, is that he was, you know, one of the eldest descendants of Nearest Green. And so you have this story. And I think what drew my attention more than anything is I knew what Jack Daniel looked like most of the world does, just from different pictures that have been used over the years. And so there was a photo of Jack. We've now really identified it as about 1904, somewhere around there. And you have Jack Daniel with this entire crew. And the crew, of course, is white, with the exception of 2 African Americans. And the crew is white, and everyone around is white, but the person to the right of Jack Daniel is an African American man. And for a lot of people, they got really fixated on the fact that there was an African American to the right of Jack Daniel, or at least that there was an African American next to Jack Daniel. What I got fixated on was that if you look at the photo, Jack Daniel ceded the center position to the African American. This was his company. This was his team. So the question was, who was this African American that was so important that the most famous American whiskey maker ever ceded the center of the only known photo he ever took to a Black man? And so it said to me that there was something more there than what was in the New York Times article. And the New York Times article was simply saying that until now, that there was a white preacher and distiller by the name of Dan Paul that Alan mentioned earlier, that had previously been given the credit of being the teacher of a young Jack Daniel. And that what Jack Daniels, the company, was now saying is it was more likely his slave that had taught Jack versus, you know, him. Now I can say, because I've done all of the research now, that particular preacher and distiller never owned any slaves, which then led me down a whole other rabbit trail of how slaves were rented. That's a whole conversation for another day. But that was something that was very common when you had someone of great skill. And so you would see that with blacksmiths, you would see that with distillers, because they were invaluable and they were costly. And so they would be rented out to multiple distilleries or multiple tanneries and things of that nature. So that's what the story was essentially saying, was a white man was given credit for what we believe was a black man's work. But that was the extent of it. There wasn't really proof. It was mostly hearsay. Well, it was all hearsay, and it was all oral history, which is usually how African-American stories are told, which is why they don't hit the history books. If you go back and you look at the woman whose dough recipe for this fast rising dough that somehow ended up with Pillsbury, if you go back and you look at Lucille's story down in Houston, her family still can't prove it. And so the question became, could this be proven? And since we've never been able to do it up until this point where it actually made it into the history books, I was fascinated by the idea that it was possible we might be able to do that for at least one in my generation. And so that's what brought me to Lynchburg, was to see, could I actually piece together proof that supported the story? And along the way, we discovered that, yes, it was correct that he was Jack's teacher and mentor, but it was so much more than that. He was also Jack's first master distiller. And then we discovered, Alan, you were talking about the Dan Call Farm earlier, which I own now. The Dan Call Farm is a 313-acre property where Jack grew up and where Nearest Green was the master distiller. It was in the research and pulling all of these documents, thousands and thousands and thousands from 6 different states, that we discovered that the original distillery number 7 is what sat on the Dan Call Farm. And so, you know, around early 1870s, the IRS went through there, redrew the lines, changed it to distillery number 16, but they never went by that distillery number. It always went by the original distillery number. So once we were able to piece that together, and there were things that were found underground that helped us to figure out that the original Jack Daniel distillery was not where it is now, but it was at the Dan Call Farm. And one of those things was about 9 inches under the ground with a metal detector, was the only known metal jug stencil that is still in existence to this day that says Jack Daniel, no apostrophe S. And so at the time when that was uncovered, I don't think anyone actually knew that Jack Daniel Distillery began there. They thought that, well, he learned how to make whiskey there, and he made whiskey in partnership with someone else, but the current location was the original. And it was that piece of metal that led us to then more documents that allowed us to put together the timeline. So I came here for one very simple story, which was he was the teacher. What we uncovered after I got here is vastly, vastly greater than what I thought I was going to uncover once I arrived.
Fawn, I'm a distilling dork, so I've got to ask this.
Yes.
So, because Brian and I are both obsessed with capturing yeast from old historic sites.
Yes.
Have you thought about capturing yeast from the old Dan Call place?
So here's the deal with skits. I've had a ton of archaeologists and a ton of different schools, including one of the universities there in Kentucky, that have agreed to excavate the property. And I will tell you why I haven't. Because if they come across bones, the state takes over. And I'm not interested in the state taking over. And so we've been doing a little bit on our own as we can to try to sort of figure this whole thing out as much as we could. And then I think we will do that at some point. But every archaeologist that came out said, you know, there's a really, really good chance that by the original distillery, there's going to be graves and they may be unmarked. And if that's the case, then, you know, my property turns into the state. And so the answer to your question is no, but we are still very much so considering when is the timing to do that. I do think we should. The question is when, and how deep do we dig?
Very good.
Nice.
Now, if this isn't leading the conversation too far too quick, I know when we were in the midst of developing our distillery project, when we read about the work that you were doing down there, and I know the thought that I had, because we knew that we had African American distillers. There were two populations of Locust Grove. There was the family that owned the place, and there was the African Americans who worked the place. And so we knew that was the case. And so when I read about your work, it was the first thing that occurred to me was here's a window, here's a glimmer of light on this broad topic that is so hard to get at. Do you have any thoughts on that, on what light that what you're doing very specifically there is going to shine on the overall idea?
Well, you know, here's the thing is when you're talking about the original distilleries, right? We know that there were Black distillers. We know that there were Black workers at all of them. Find me one where there isn't, and you know, I'll give you some kind of certificate for it. I don't know that there are any that weren't. But the reality is they are businesses, right? And so what my hope has always been, as Uncle Nearest, the brand, grows, and it grows so exponentially fast, my hope has always been that the capitalism mindset of these publicly traded companies and these other guys, that they will do the work of going back into their files, if only because they see it could be a brand. Because the way that I was able to uncover so much about Nearest is I tracked Jack, and I tracked Jack's family. And the blessing we have there that nobody else has that we know of so far is Jack and his family always gave Nearest credit. So it wasn't difficult to find information to substantiate once I started tracking them, because they put it in print. They put it in interviews that they did, in literally newspapers and magazines. They were very clear in saying who Nearest Green was. And then also Jack's biography, 1967, written at the height of the Civil Rights era. You've got a white reporter from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that goes to tell the definitive biography of the most famous white whiskey maker, and includes a Black family, an enslaved man and his family, more times than Jack's own family. And so you have literally a family that, to me, was making sure Nearest Green's legacy could not be forgotten. And I think the only reason that I've been able to do what I've been able to do is because they did that. Now, how the history got lost, I got some ideas on that, but I can't prove them, so I'm definitely not going to say them. But what I do know for certain is Nearest's story was not lost under Jack or Jack's descendants when they ran the distillery, without question. So his last descendant to run the distillery, Reverend Motlow, passed away in '78. One of Nearest's descendants, who now lives in Houston, she remembers her mom calling her in '79, really distraught, because she had taken friends to the distillery, to Jack Daniel Distillery, for a tour. She had done that with friends forever, with college friends and all the rest of that stuff. And she called and she said, they've whitewashed my grandfather out of the story. So we know it happened between '78 and '79. So I've been able to narrow it down to a 12-month period of time where the story was lost. But in '78 and before, if you had gone to the distillery, Nearest Green would have been mentioned all throughout. He was no secret under Jack's family. So that's the only reason I believe that I've been able to do what I've been able to do. And so for the other distilleries, because most of the records as it relates to African Americans are going to be with the white families, it has to be those families that actually pull the paperwork out. And when they were doing that in Lynchburg for me, where you literally had people, every Friday, I would put a newspaper ad out. And I would say, these are the last names that I was looking for. And it was Green, it was Wagoner, it was Daniel, and it was Call. I said, if you have documents with any of these last names, whether it's in your attic, in your basement, if you've ever seen them in the South, a lot of times you'll buy a home and there's records. The home I live in right now, went into the attic and there were boxes and boxes of old newspapers. And so that's pretty common here. And I don't know if it's common everywhere else, but it's very common here. So I knew that there would be documents. And I remember every Friday when I would take out that ad, I would get calls at the Dan Call Farm, which I had turned into my research room. And I'd get calls saying, hey, I've got this, I've got that, I found this, I don't know if this means anything. And I remember the day I got a voice message that said, my wife, she worked at the courthouse, and before it burned down. And she saved a box of papers. Now, I don't know how true that story is, but the document that he had, he said, it says Minnie Green. Does this mean anything to you? She was suing a gentleman, yada, yada, yada. I said, absolutely, that's Nearest Green's daughter. I'll be right over. I had no information on Minnie Green other than a photo of her. Now I had a photo and a lawsuit and got a little bit of background into how she did business. And so those were the kind of things that this community had to basically pull out of their basements and their attics so I could put the story together. The metal bottle stencil, the metal jug stencil, I didn't find that. My archaeologist didn't find that. That was one of Jack's descendants who had found it on the Dan Paul farm 20 years before and brought it over and said, Fawn, this belongs here. I found this when metal detecting, and he took me to where he found it, which is how we began uncovering that is where the original distillery was. And so if Jack's family and Nearest's family and the entire community if they had been afraid of the truth coming out, then I never would have been able to piece the story together, because it took all of them. And so my hope is with all of the other distilleries, whether it's the families or it's those who are there, they've got the boxes. Pull them out and start digging and stop running from it. And so my hope is, if for no other reason than capitalism, they'll do it. I don't care why they do it. I just care that they do it. Because what Nearest's family has been able to, what it has meant to them for this story to come forward. I had a couple of them texting me last night some pictures because they were at a restaurant and they were drinking one of the Uncle Nearest cocktails that were on the menu. And I texted back and I said, did you tell them who you were? And they were like, absolutely. I mean, you have 100 descendants that can walk into any restaurant at any given time and say, that's my ancestor. The pride that they get from being able to do that, and every single time we win an award, they're like, we won another gold. It is a collective, right? And so this legacy of excellence that Nearest had, that he passed down to his children and his grandchildren, there was a bit of a gap, because in Tennessee, Prohibition began 10 years before federal Prohibition. And so here, Jack Daniel Distillery wasn't even here. It moved to St. Louis. And it was in St. Louis from 1910 until it reopened here after Prohibition. And we were the last state back in after Prohibition. So we were the first in, the last one's out. And so you have this 30-year gap. Well, the family did not continue in the distilling business as they had prior. And so there was a different level of prestige, a different level of respect when Nearest and his children and his grandchildren, when they walked the streets of Lynchburg, the amount of respect they garnered was the same as Jack and his family. But all of that was somewhat lost over time because they were no longer in the distilling business. It's kind of like Hollywood, you know, what's your last picture? It's the same thing. And so what they have been able to regain in their own family pride and ancestry is enormous. So my hope is that there will be other families that will be able to discover this about their ancestral roots, because it matters. It matters if you know, I came from an entrepreneur that was incredibly successful. I came from, when you know that you came from a legacy of excellence, you try to achieve that again.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, there are two big branches I see here to go off in. This is amazing. I want to throw out a couple of questions before they get lost in the feed. Robin Caldwell would like to know, have the Green descendants had DNA testing? If so, where in Africa would potentially Nearest family have come?
Yeah, so I got them all DNA testing, and it says West Africa, not super helpful. And this was this was back in 2016. And so Ancestry.com has advanced a great deal since then. And then there's also an African ancestry DNA that I actually wanted to take, and I couldn't take it because my mother is half German. And it is that side of the family. So she would have had to have been full and African ancestry for that to work. And so that does exist, but the challenge is that we don't know, we know the name of the wife. I've never been able to track a single document on this woman. Her family can't find a document on her. They've been trying, they can't find anything. It's like she appeared out of nowhere, married nearest, had 11 children, disappeared out of nowhere. We have 0 documents on this woman. And so if it's going through the mother, it's really, really difficult to know. So anyhow, that is a challenge we have run into, but I would probably say it's coming along so well that I would hope within the next couple of years, they could take it again and get more specific results. But at that time, it essentially said, you know, you're this % West African, which wasn't helpful at all. We already knew that part.
Robin would also like to know, did Nearest family move to St. Louis because of the Daniel Distillery there?
Yeah, so Nearest has 5 branches of his family, essentially. There's one in this area, Lynchburg, Tullahoma. There's one in Indiana. There's one in St. Louis. There's one in Houston. And then there's a couple of family members in Atlanta. But that's pretty much where the family is. The family in St. Louis had no idea why they were there before I came and shared my research. Because no one ever talks about the fact that Jack Daniel Distillery was there for a full 10 years before federal prohibition began. And so they had no idea. I got a text message. I'm a big texter, so most of the stuff is text. But I got a text message from Nearest's eldest descendant in St. Louis right after her mother, Mamie, died. And she sends me a text message and she sends me a picture of a newspaper clipping of the opening of Jack Daniel Distillery in St. Louis. And it was found as the last page in her mother's photo album. So they're going through the photo album, looking at all these different photos. And she says, do you have any idea why my mother's photo album, no, it didn't say St. Louis, it just said Jack Daniel, and it was an article on it. And she said, do you have any idea why my mother would have this article on Jack Daniel? And she sent it to me and I said, look closer. It says St. Louis. But they had no idea. So I went up there and the original Jack Daniel Distillery was still there. And there was still a bit of ink. They literally just raised the building last year, at the end of last year. So I was able to climb over the fence. It was not safe at all because it's right off of a train track. But I was able to climb over a fence and like pull myself up. So, and the windows are all black and all the rest of that stuff. But I was able to find exactly where it was.
That was
Robin said,
also,
I'm writing about that distillery now. Very cool. Robin, have you been to the St. Louis location? Yes, beautiful. So yeah.
that was also the site of the largest heist in whiskey history.
Oh,
Really?
that
Was
story,
that
is that
distillery.
not nuts?
Yes, it's insane. I
That-
had a question for you and Andrea in particular, if you guys don't mind, because one thing that we do at our distillery at Spirits of French Lick is we like to use a lot of the local characters, right? We're kind of using I'm a history geek, obviously, so we're kind of using our platform in order to honor different historical characters. So in Southern Indiana, I'm very interested, and I've been trying to dig for any African-American distillers I can find. So unfortunately, the region that I'm in was also basically the home to the Knights of the Golden Circle at one point in time. So by 1865, I mean, there were multiple African-American communities here, and I know there were multiple African-Americans working in the distilleries. We have records of them working in distilleries. We might even have a first name and know a burial site, but the records are gone. I mean, you know, it got wiped out after the Civil War. And so it's hard sometimes, and I would argue sometimes maybe on the line between the North and the South in particular, it might be even harder to find those things because there was more of that sort of unfortunate unfolding of events that happened right on the line than I think people realized did. I mean, we have a rich African-American heritage here in Washington County, but nobody knows about it because everything was destroyed. Everything was wiped out. It's literally all gone. We can't find anything on it. So I'm with you, Fawn. I would love to see more brands do that sort of thing and honor these people. I mean, we literally just put out a whiskey that honored a woman who ran a brothel in a little conservative town, because why wouldn't we? It's awesome, right? So, but
Well, Alex,
finding those.
I can can tell you, and I don't know if you've gone this route yet, but even though so many documents burned here, the courthouse burned down twice, and the 1890 federal census burned, well, it burned in most states, and for whatever reason, the government decided since those states didn't have it, they were going to burn the rest. I still don't understand that, but we have no 1890 census because it's burned. I will tell you what records remained fully intact, at least in this area. Every single IRS record. I had to go to 4 different states to get them, but I have every IRS record for every single distiller anywhere near Lynchburg. And when I went to, I remember going to you have to kind of figure out which archives has the IRS records for Indiana. I'm not sure. I'd venture to say that's probably going to be the one in Maryland, at College Park, Maryland. But most of the records for the South are in right outside of Atlanta. And I scheduled to go down there with the archivist. He pulled a lot of stuff for me. And I remember arriving, and they put me in an all glass room with security cameras at literally every single area. And you had a security guard that sat there watching my every move. Now, I'm the only person in there watching my every move. I could only take in a pencil, and I could take in my phone, and that was it. But as they rolled out these carts, it was unbelievable, because you have these huge IRS books that had been, I don't know what that saran wrap is called, like the special saran wrap that they use for that, but they had never been opened. So from the time they were sealed, no one had ever come down there to look at them. So I was the first one to unwrap them and to open them and to take all these photos. But I mean, I know the saying is kind of seems cliche, but follow the money. And that's exactly what I did. A lot of what I was able to uncover here in Lynchburg was following the money through the different IRS records and figuring out who was doing what. And because if the government wasn't going to do anything, they were going to get their money. So that was incredibly helpful. It's also where I discovered that, and my husband hates when I say this. He's like, babe, you cannot say that categorically. But I'm like, whiskey free the slaves. And he hates when I say that. But if you go back and you look at the records and you look at those documents, the North was out of money, completely running out of money. It was not going to be able to finish the war. And the question became, what wasn't being taxed that could be taxed? Cotton was being taxed, tobacco was being taxed. What could they get money from? And the answer became spirits. That is what they were going to tax. The highest excise tax, is why our excise tax is stupid now, was because of this taxation to fight the Civil War, to keep it going. And when you look at those records, it is unbelievable to see how much of the money from the war came from whiskey. It's remarkable. So those are the kind of things that when you start going down that money rabbit trail, it gets really, really interesting.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. For
Just
sure.
Just to piggyback off of Fawn, because she hit it spot on, like in your brain, when you're going through these stories or you're trying to figure out something, I guess your brain always wants to get you to these places that you'll just easily find what you're looking for. But every historian told me, follow the land and follow the money. Everyone I've talked to across industry said, familiarize yourself with transfer of land, any old accounting ledgers. So I was pulling ledger books, anything that I could find financial, because I said, I'm going to have to do more digging, but it really gives you the framework for operations, who would have been doing what, who was a trusted slave, and maybe other tasks that they would have had. So it's really just allowing yourself to really be led by information. And with Heather and I'm telling you, it's been like piece and puzzles, because as we're going through these farm exchange letters and just other things that we found, it's like, oh, well, you know, this person transferred whiskey as commerce, or, you know, they were transferring goods, or they were doing all of these things, and there may be a slave in the middle of that. So you're trying to figure out, well, did they belong to this farm, or were they a part of this property? And it's like, well, we'll just add them to this one file that they were here on this date and time. And as far as their expertise in renting out slaves, I've been finding a ton of that. You see a rent of labor. You know, you may have needed these particular slaves at this particular part because they were distilling a particular spirit. We do know that there was a good amount of rum running through Kentucky as well, as far as American whiskey, other spirits. But that's why it's so important, Alan, that you can't allow your mind to just get fixated on one thing, because I'm telling you, the story will pivot to something else. So you just got to open your mind to, you know, there could be women that pop up into the story, not color.
There definitely
And a lot
are.
of my research is more from the perspective of enslaved women and their contributions to distilling. As minor as they are, they were a part of that process, and rightfully so. You wouldn't pull one of your large slave hands to constantly stir mash. You would do that with a woman because she was to wood burn cooking, and that's what you would have been doing as you were building your mash. And you needed someone familiar with that that could just constantly stir all day. So you're not going to pull a slave hand to do that at your distillery. It would have been a woman. So we're finding that out at Locust Grove, you know, the role of enslaved women when it comes to crop processing. And that whiskey wasn't initially all commerce. A lot of it was food preservation. You had a lot of grains left over from the mills, and people had to figure out what to do with their product so it didn't spoil. So you see these early measures of sustainability, agricultural techniques that came from Africa. Something that I love that Michael Twitty said when he came on the property at Locust Grove is that to always remember that the slaves came here empty-handed, but not empty-headed. And I think that that's something that we always when we're talking about enslaved contribution to these historic spaces.
So one of the interesting things that we have in southern Indiana, there was a distiller named Benjamin Radcliffe who came to southern Indiana very on from Jessamine County, Kentucky. And he inherited a distillery, some stock whiskey, and then obviously as well slaves, and then came to Indiana. Of course, Indiana wasn't a slave state, but one of the interesting aspects is that they came with him, and we know that there was a woman that was with him, and her first name was Mary, and she was a distiller. And obviously the family and the community, you know, they took her in as well. She's actually buried right in the same area with him alongside her family. And it's just an interesting story, you know, that I would love to have more on. Sometimes it's, and what I was getting at when I say it's a little harder to find those things here. For example, Indiana not being a slave state, but there was sort of this unwritten law up until the mid-1850s that if you brought a slave into Indiana, as long as you took the slave back to that slave state within 6 months, then it wasn't necessary. It was kind of you bring them across, they're there for a while. As long as you take them back, then they're not considered a freed person. And so finding those sort of records and those sort of things have been a little harder to find. But I know they're out there. It's just a matter of getting to them, and it's a story that needs to be told, especially to complete the history of, you know, southern Indiana distilling. Those are stories that I'm going to have to track down one way or the other, and I'm more than happy to do it and committed to doing it. It just gets a little hazy sometimes to find those things.
And anytime, Alan, I've held a lecture, I always do pre-promotion and ask people, like, if you find something or you think that there's a story connected to the property that I'm hosting, please bring that. I've had people bring birth certificates, letters, everything to lectures. And I'm grateful when they do that. Because, you know, I believe that people don't know what they have, and they could be hidden gems, you know, to them, maybe nothing, something that they were getting ready to toss out. And I'm like, whoa, no, don't do that. You know, that's just really been invaluable. And I had so many people after I hosted the first lecture at Locust Grove come to me with, you know, hey, have you looked into this place? Or, you know, I believe, you know, my family was here. When we connected with the descendant, it was crazy because he was actually in the process of working on opening a distillery, and he had no idea why he was even interested in distilling. Like, it just never crossed his mind that he had any ancestors that had any distilling experience. So, and back to what Fawn said, I think that that heritage and that legacy rebirthing that in the future generation is so important, and keeping the stories alive. And my hope is that as we continue to archive and do all of this collaborative work, that we'll do a better job archiving, because the new generation is so technology driven. And I believe that all of this research should be publicly accessible to anyone that would want to pick up wherever Fawn and I leave off in our ventures. You know, I hope that someone comes behind me and they say, well, you know what, I'm gonna pick up the baton of this and, you know, expand the story. Because I don't think it can be a one person thing. I think it's really just all of us, you know, finding our piece and passing it to the next historian, the next curious.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I think it's like chapters in a book. You know, it's chapters in small and big. And the thing about the modern technology is what I've found is it's such a useful tool to sit at your computer and research archives. But like Fawn, what you talked about is there are hidden gems in small historical societies and people's personal collections. Not everything's digitized. I think there's tons of distilling history and milling history that's yet to be told because it's sitting in a box in the middle of the local county historical society. Like when I worked at Stratford Hall before I worked at Mount Vernon, which was the Lee family home, down in the local courthouse, all the early books were there. And I found incredible documents of land surveys for mills. One of them I remember in 1781, where the man who drew the map colored the trees green.
Wow.
And he drew this whole area where this mill was. So I think that we got to keep digging. And then what you just said is bring it forward by digitizing what we find so more people can have access to it. And the other thing I just say, Fawn, in addition to whiskey winning the war, I understand that General Grant was fueled by whiskey, if you believe what Abraham Lincoln said. So I think on both ends of the spectrum, it was certainly driving the train.
Yeah.
And Robin, I saw her post in the chat the fact that she's doing the story in St. Louis of that milking. And I don't know if you've already done this, but I can point you in one direction if you haven't. The local universities there, in their archives, and none of this is digitized, which is insane. But I was trying to do research, and so I went into one of the libraries and one of the universities, and I said, I'm looking for, you know, anything on Jack Daniel Distillery here in St. Louis. And they said, sure. And they pulled out of a file cabinet an envelope with clippings of, I mean, and if that's what they were doing, if that's what they were doing in that, you know, at that period of time, when you're talking about 1910, and I mean, all of the articles on this massive fire and all the rest of the stuff, I couldn't find any of that online, but the clippings were in an envelope. And it's funny because when Jack Daniels put out the rye, what year was that? A couple of years ago, when they put out their rye. Actually, I think it was last year maybe. And the thought was that they had not produced rye before. I said, oh, no, you guys have produced rye. I have a letter from President Taft with his signature thanking you guys for the rye whiskey of the Lincoln County type. And because he didn't drink, but his wife received the case and she absolutely loved it. It was so I was like, here's a copy of the letter. I literally had it on my phone.
That's awesome.
But generally, I mean, but that was up in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They produced apple brandy way back when too, but you know, to Steve's thing and your all's commentary, that's how I found most of the things that I've found on the early distillers that I'm after is through digging through these old books and old history books and trying to find just one or two lines about anything. Because again, where we're at and the unfortunate thing during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Knights of the Golden Circle, they also went after distillers. They wanted to wipe distillers out, and so they erased a lot of that history too. So, but I've talked to Steve and Ryan about this before. I have suspicions that somewhere in southern Indiana, because where we're located at, this little 6-county region, there were 155 distilleries here. There's literally 3 pictures that we know of any of those distilleries. There's 3 buildings left standing of those 155. Somebody has got a barn full of distilling equipment somewhere and does not realize what they have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody here throws anything away, right?
Right.
We just keep moving it around.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody has got a heck of a collection and don't realize what it is.
Oh,
sure.
wow. And
Real
something
quick.
that I was able to do during COVID that was just very helpful for me, research-wise, and really just kept me going, because you hit a wall at some point in your research. There were a lot of bartenders that were out of work, so I said, well, I have all these documents I need to go through, you know, I'll pay you all if you want to help.
Nice.
So I was able to get about 25 bartenders on land surveys and different things. And I mean, they would say, hey, I think I found something, or, you know, and they got really excited just about just reading and learning, and they had questions and enthusiasm. And I just, it just really gave me a lot more motivation to keep going with the project, to like not get discouraged and like feeling like I didn't have a big find, and really treating this more as like a journey instead of a destination. And I think it really just helped me just in a way to really want to give proper homage to these stories and these people, and really keep it very human driven, so that as we're doing programming and building experiential, that's where I feel like we have the opportunity to build community, because everyone can relate to being a person, being a human being. And I think that if we drew our attention there, and versus all the things that we could think of that make us different and keep us apart, you know, how we build community, resonating to Fawn, helping families build a family tree, and how important that is, that people know where they're from and how they're connected. And I just think that's just such a beautiful opportunity. And I hope that the bartenders will stay through the project, because as soon as things started opening up, I was like, okay, guys, you know, I have more paper that we need to go and but it's just been wonderful for them. So I hope that I'll be able to add on some new archivists to our project.
I love
We
it.
have
I see
go
a
ahead.
question from Dan Schofield. Do you mind
Yeah.
if I answer it? Dan, I see, hey Dan, by the way, the question is, assuming Nearest is the eldest or the oldest identified master distiller, who is the next most senior African-American? Well, I think we still only know Nearest truly, and the second most senior would be the African-American who was in that photo that caught my attention to begin with, the African-American who Jack ceded the center of his team photo to, and that is Nearest's son, George Green. And the irony is, Alan, when you were talking about Indiana, so Nearest's family that's up in Indiana, in Indianapolis specific, was hugely instrumental in helping to piece together the story here in Lynchburg, because it was the granddaughter of so George Green was Nearest's son, who's in the center of that photo, and it's his granddaughter who he raised until he passed away. And she wanted to come back home and to do a tour of Jack Daniel Distillery. Well, she's older and we were gonna have to push her in a wheelchair. So I reached into them and I said, hey, can we do this private tour of Nearest's triple great granddaughter, or great great granddaughter? And so they, you know, said yes. And so we went up there, and it was amazing as she was able to go through, because she lived at the top of the hill. So what is now the top of Jack Daniel, that land all belonged to her grandfather. Their children sold it back to the distillery, and Miss Helen is her name, and Miss Helen is that person who tells it just like it is. I love those people. and she's like, yeah, they didn't get enough for it. I told them they weren't getting enough for it. But they sold it back. But she was able to go up there and talk about how she used to play up there, and how Lim Watlow, so this is who Robin was talking about earlier. So Jack's descendant Lim, his nephew, is who he turned the distillery over to in 1907, even though he didn't pass away until 1911. He turned that over in 1907. He was quite sick, quite ill. And once he turned it over, Lim really he took it over, and Lim would probably say that he had been running it anyway. But nonetheless, that's when he officially got it. And Lim was a drinker. And Robin, I'm sure, knows this in her research. He was a drinker, and he got himself in trouble quite a bit for drinking. But one of the things that she told me is she said, yeah, the only person who Lim would listen to was my daddy George. And so every time Lim would drink too much, they would come up and get Daddy George, and Daddy George would go down and talk Lim, and he's like, Lim, you know you can't talk to people. Lim, you know you can't throw stuff at people. Lim, you know you can't yell. And so even that to me was astounding, that at that time frame, right? You're talking about early 1900s, that the only person who could get Lim to be respectful when he was drinking was a Black person. So
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask you about, because I know I've done a lot of research on Jack Daniels and Lim as well, and Lim was definitely a character for sure.
He was a character. Robin, I'd be interested to know where you got that he slung the N-word quite a bit. That's not what I understand from any of Nearest's family. But I will say that what people have said is that he was a son of a bitch, but he was a son of a bitch to everybody. It didn't matter if you were white or Black. He was, and a lot of people confuse that something that happened up in St. Louis, which landed him into a murder case, and that's a whole other subject. And a lot of people still think he killed a Black person, and he didn't. He actually killed the white person. It was kind of crazy, but the trouble as in shooting a white man for defending a Black man, he called it. Yeah, so that's, Robin asked me about that because I've got a lot of research on that particular situation, and I wouldn't believe everything you read on that, but nonetheless, he was absolutely an SOB to everybody. That was his style. So whether you talk to somebody who was white and related to him, or if you talk to somebody who was Black, they have the exact same story about that man.
You know, it would be interesting, and maybe you have something on this, I don't know, but it'd be interesting to know what the take with the Green family was when Lim and Jack had their initial little falling out, and Lim went and started the little brandy distillery and all that stuff, like how that all played out and what their perspective was.
You know, I don't know. And Miss Helen, the thing that I was really fortunate is there were a lot of people still alive when I got here that are no longer here. Miss Helen, I was given the most greatest honor of being able to share her family's history at her funeral.
Wow.
And she and I have become really great friends, and the amazing stories that she shared with me, it is counter to what we understand about Blacks and whites during Jim Crow era in the South. The stories, I remember saying to her one day, because in Lynchburg, as odd as it is, because of the name of the town, it's one of the few towns in the South that didn't follow Jim Crow laws. The courthouse followed the Jim Crow law. It had to by law. And there were only 2 stores that followed Jim Crow law. Everybody else, Black, white, they did business the exact same way in the stores in Lynchburg. And I remember people telling me about these 2 stores that were that did follow the Jim Crow, and they were the 2 places that served ice cream. And it would make sense because the courthouse was the county courthouse. So the rule was, as long as you could ride in on your horse and get back home before dark, that was the distance that courthouse was. You had to be able to ride to the courthouse, do business, and get home before dark. And so you had people that were coming up from Alabama, coming up from, all over into this courthouse. So the sweet shops were trying to appeal to all these people that were coming in from neighboring areas. And the last thing that these folks in neighboring areas would be expecting would be Black people sitting at a counter having ice cream with everybody else. And so those were the 2 places that they were not allowed to go in. And I remember saying to Miss Helen, I said, so Miss Helen, so everybody tells me about the manager that was at the coffee cup. And I said, so what was it? And this was one of the sweet shops. I said, what was it like to have to go through the back door to get your ice cream? And Miss Helen said, why would I go through the back door to get my ice cream? I said, well, didn't you have to go through the back door? She said, why? The ice cream was through the front door. And I literally had, have her on my little iPad, because then she and I are just having dialogue on it. And I used to record everything. And so she and I were having dialogue. But when this conversation began, I had to pull out my iPad and just like lift it up and go, okay, so Miss Helen, help me to understand what would happen when you would go get your ice cream. And she said, I'd go through the front door, I'd pay my nickel, I'd get my ice cream, I'd eat my ice cream, I'd go home. And she had this complete look of confusion. I said, but Miss Helen, during the Jim Crow laws, you had to go through the back. Her exact quote to me, I will never forget it, is, I don't know nothing about no Jim Crow laws. And when she would tell the stories of her family, she said that the first time she experienced racism was when she moved to Indiana. She had never experienced it, and she grew up in Lynchburg. And so she gets to Indiana and she's like, what's wrong with you people? Like, she had absolutely no idea. And so there are, as Robin had pointed out earlier, there is so much, it's not black and white. None of it is black and white. It is absolutely complicated. Our history is so nuanced. And where we get in trouble is trying to put it in buckets. Every white person was this, every enslaved person was this, everyone's journey was this, and that simply isn't true. And I think that the greatest gift we can all give to ourselves is the ability to learn each story individually and to accept that there were good whites. There were good, like, there is a nuance to all of this. And I remember when I first started telling this story, and Nearest's eldest descendants, I was able to interview Nearest's granddaughter, who was still alive. When I interviewed her, she was 106, still lived at home by herself.
Wow.
She passed away at 108. Jack's eldest descendant was 103. And when I got this picture of Nearest's family, all of his grandchildren, and there were 7 of them, and there was an empty chair. And everyone could tell me, well, that was at the funeral of Reed because that was the empty chair. But when I would ask the African-American elders and Nearest's family to name all of the descendants, or all the grandchildren, they didn't know which was which. They only knew that was the grandchild's picture. Well, I shoot it on my phone. I send it over to Jack's eldest descendant, and she's like, that's cousin Jesse, that's cousin Ott, that's cousin Otis, that's cousin. She could tell me all of them and tell me where their houses were, where their properties were. They owned a full block here with just one house, and across the street, they owned the other block with just one house. And I mean, so we think that we hold all of our stories, and the reality is at least what I have found in relation to this story, I will not put this on anyone else's. What I have found is that the story was incredibly nuanced, and I had to be so open to accept the information as it came. And when Nearest's family would share their experiences with me, and I knew that some people would not especially like that I was changing the narrative of a story, that when I stepped into it, Jack Daniel and his family was being ripped through the mud because people had come to the conclusion that Jack had stolen the recipe, Nearest was his slave, and that he hid Nearest. None of that was true. But that was the story that was out there. So then you have this African-American woman that's coming forth and going, look, this is what it is. But the reason why I was able to do that with absolute resolve is because Nearest's eldest descendants were like, Fawn, you tell this truth and you tell it as it was. And they were not going to allow people to try to bully this story into something other than what it really truly was. And so I have had the distinct honor and pleasure of probably having been involved in uncovering one of the rare few positive stories between a Black family and a white family during a period of time when that is something that is rather unheard of. And nobody was perfect, but we sure as hell aren't now. So,
wow.
Yeah. And I was able to go, I was very fortunate. I was able to attend a founder's tour with Uncle Nearest. If you all ever get invited to the founder's tour, do not say no. Like, clear your schedule. You will laugh, you will cry, you will do all the things. And something that I just love is how Fawn shares this story of how the families played together. You know, there are pictures of them together at the Dan Call farm. Fawn lives in a museum, literally. And I mean, just the way that she just brought that history together. I mean, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is or where you're from, you can relate to that story in some level. And I just love what the Nearest brand is doing and how they're preserving legacy and not leaving anyone out. Like, you're by elevating this unknown master distiller, it's not, you know, deflating the Jack Daniels brand at all. Like, it really brings all these stories full circle. And I think that's so important when we're getting into history, that, you know, we don't see it through a very siloed lens, that we are very open, because the stories are constantly being built. You know, Fawn is getting more history, and I mean, she even said she's still actively researching.
Oh yeah.
You know, she didn't stop. So I think that there's more that we're going to hear from the nearest brand, and I'm excited.
Yeah, when the conservator of the Tennessee State Museum, she's the conservator for over 30 years, and they announced them in the paper in Nashville that she was retiring. She literally got a text message from me immediately saying, "So what are you going to be doing in your free time?" And I immediately hired her to help me continue doing the research, because however much longer I am here on this earth, I want to be able to piece as many of this together and then pass it on. And I hope that whoever it's passed on to will continue putting those pieces together until the story is absolutely complete. And I think that that's something we can all do with the different stories that we come in contact with. Maybe not as obsessively as I did, but you know.
Obsessive is a good thing.
We're both obsessed. We're all obsessed.
So
You're definitely obsessed. That's what I love about you.
As usual, we could take this thing till 9, 10 o'clock and still probably not run out of stuff to talk about. A few things that have come to my mind as we've been talking are a few landmarks in a few different categories. And I want to talk a little bit, see if we can brainstorm a little bit about change over time, because we wouldn't have had a special episode on women in distilling. We wouldn't have had a special episode on African Americans in distilling if it wasn't worth remarking upon now. So we've got, in the late 18th, early 19th century, we've got Mount Vernon is a great example of an industrial distillery where there's enslaved African Americans working. We've got Locust Grove is a great example of a small farm distillery, just part of crop processing, where enslaved African Americans were working. And so you got these two realities that kind of change with the 1862 excise tax. And then again, whatever we talk about on this show always includes prohibition, because that was such a game changer. And I'm sure I'm missing some big landmarks along here, but how do we take these different categories, these different landmarks, and how do we then get to a place where this is something remarkable to talk about?
But may I offer one thing that I think answers part of the question, is that I think it goes back to the idea of what is skilled labor in different centuries. And we assume certain groups of people, because of education or wealth, were the skilled laborers. Well, in the slavery context in Virginia, and I've got this on several plantations, they would apprentice a slave to a carpenter, a joiner, a blacksmith. And obviously the economic part was for the owner, he did not have to pay a wage. But those skills carry on. Once somebody learns something like that, you can't take it away from them.
Right.
And so their son or relative is trained. And so you get to the middle of the 19th century, you have a lot of people, and including women, because I know many mill stories, even in Europe, where the husband died and the woman became the miller. And so I think that's a thread that runs under all this, is that skilled labor is not as defined as we think it is. It's all sorts of people, because of the happenstance of life, get a skill and they pass it on.
Yes.
And as the economy grows, obviously there's economies of scale. We get more industrial, that warps it a bit. But I think from 1750 to 1850 or 60, that labor was valuable. So for instance, we talked about rented slaves earlier. It also works the other way. People rented skilled labor, but also it impacts slaves that aren't skilled. There was one great book on industrial slavery talking about a slave that worked at an iron furnace in Virginia, and he was very skilled. So August came in Virginia, like it is right now, it's boiling hot. He left the furnace to see a girlfriend he had on another property, but the owner didn't go get him, didn't send the authorities to get him. He wrote a letter to a friend and complained that he had gone away from the furnace, but he needed him. He needed him, so he let him spend his time away. September came, he was back, he's making pig iron. But a number of slaves from the adjoining property were rented as just common labor. And they saw, how come that guy's treated that way? He's treated with deference, and we're here, we're field hands. We're not treated that way. So the owner of those rented slaves would not rent to the furnace anymore. Because when those men went back, they had a different attitude. Like, why are we not treated like the guy? Well, it was about he had a skill, and you referenced that earlier, Fawn, that this skill did a lot of things for people in the terrible conditions they were in. And to wrap it up, this particular slave who was an iron maker, when he made extra iron, he got paid. He bought his own family out of servitude because he'd saved enough money to free himself and his kids.
Wow.
So you know.
I'll add that. Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm wrapping up.
I was going to say that the one thing I'd add that brings it to modern times is, you know, talking about skilled labor and that whole thing and who had those skills, you know, bringing in the more modern times and especially being able to look back on things. That skilled labor, there's a very fine line between skilled labor and what we now think of as art. And so someone like Nearest was also an artist because he's running a pot still, right? He knew things that there are a lot of distillers right now in modern times. Nearest would have been in front of it, don't understand the intricacies of it and the beauty of it and how it works. So those skills also mirror art, you know, and that's a pretty neat thing, I think. And I think that's what brings us all together now, you know, where you can have a narrative and you can have a product, a very particular product, that brings people together that you can also use as a platform to tell interesting stories about culture and history and the people of local places and cultures, even if that history is marred by some dark times, obviously. So.
Well, and piggybacking on what Steve was saying earlier, one of the things that I found most fascinating that I wasn't expecting is when I was going through the records and found that Nearest Green was the wealthiest African American in this area, and he was wealthier than a lot of his white neighbors. And so when I'm looking at that, I'm going, whoa, wait a minute, how is this, you know, how is this even possible? And how did his grandsons literally own full blocks in downtown Lynchburg? I mean, Lynchburg is only so big. So how did his grandsons own full blocks and only have their single houses on them? And I mean, it just is. And so it is going back to what Andrea was saying earlier, follow the money. And that begins to help you to piece it together. And if you're lucky enough, like I was, to find an archive that has Mason books in them, because those Mason books are supposed to go to the Grand Lodge. But sometimes the folks who hold the books will die, and their relatives or whoever, they either don't know the significance or didn't like the fact that they were Masons and will give it to the local library. To tell you the stuff I was able to find in the 2 Mason books that should never have been anywhere but the Grand Lodge, wow. Every single distiller here was a Mason, except Jack Daniel. That is a whole other story for another day. But literally every single distiller except for Jack was a Mason.
Well, maybe he didn't want to partake in the strange rituals.
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea. It's how I discovered what it means to be blackballed was, you know, with the Masons, right? And so I don't really have a way of knowing if Jack had been blackballed because he was so close to African Americans. Right. That would not have been a thing there. I mean, yes, they understood it in Lynchburg, but they didn't understand that in the surrounding areas. And so I don't know. I don't know if he was blackballed or if he just never tried. I just know that every single distiller in this area, every major distiller, I should say, all of the big guys were all Masons, and I was able to find information on them, but not Jack.
Well, I think I always enjoy talking with you, Fawn, at times we've gotten to, and when you came by, but which I love what you said on many points, but the nuances and the complication of all these stories is something all of us shouldn't lose sight of. These are humans, and we're all around other humans and our families. We're complicated, or as the Bible says, peculiar people. And so I think that's as you study history, you need to look at it not as a document always, but you got to look to the humanity of it, and therein you might read a document differently.
Yes.
So I think I get that from you and Andrea as well, that, you know, we got to look at the nuances of people, and then you don't write it, you know, it's not black and white all the time. There's nuances to history. And I think if we study it that way, we're more enriched, but also you get down to the real story, hopefully, if there's enough meat on the bone in what you're digging through.
Yeah.
And I'm really just so grateful to Fawn and her team and everything that they've done. Fawn has just been a great support and a resource. This work is not for the faint at heart. It is never ending. You never sleep. You take your work with you. It keeps you up at night. And she's just been very motivational and inspirational that this work means something, not just to the person conducting it, but to the community that it impacts. And that people really are interested in knowing these unknown stories and these narratives that they're not used to hearing. People are not as objective as we tend to think. People are more open-minded than we give them credit for. I believe that it's just opening up this new space for allyship and advocacy, and discussing systematic racism and oppression with fresh eyes and fresh thought. So I am so grateful to Fawn and the Nearest brand, and just everything that they're doing in regards to community building, historic preservation. And I hope that as we develop our programming at Locust Grove, we'll be able to get Fawn out here once it's safe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I go into rabbit holes. You start showing me history on people, I'll be there for days just looking at one person's background. So, you know, I hope y'all got cabins or something on there.
I was about to say, I mean, just like everybody else on this panel, I mean, you've got an open invitation with us. I hope you'll join us soon. We're working on restarting things, and we do have spots you can stay over if you need to and keep digging into things. So yeah, I think we have gone through all the questions. We kept up with them pretty well. Does anybody have any final words on behalf of their organizations individually?
I'll give one final word, which is, as we're doing research on the past, figure out how it's going to make the future better. I think a lot of times when we begin digging into the past, we stay there, and that's not helpful, because we're in the current moment, which is a reflection of things that happened in the past, but it is not the past. And so we go into the past to understand it, but pull forward the things that are going to help to push us forward and to drive us forward and to make us better. Because if we are just doing research for the sake of saying everything that was wrong in the past, why don't we just all give a collective, there was a whole lot of wrong stuff in the past, and now how do we create a better for everybody else that is here right now? And so that's the only thing that I would say, because we all are digging in the past, and we all love it. But if the past doesn't lead you to a better and brighter future, then you may be barking up the wrong tree a little bit and may need to just adjust.
And the thing is, there's not one thing we can do about the past.
We can't do anything about it.
But we can affect the present and teach about the past in an informed way.
Yeah.
And if you're saying change the past, does that mean you're referring to Brian and our period clothing that we're always in?
No, I think Brian, this is just who he is. He's just that's his stilo. You got to let him represent exactly who he is.
I would love to catch Brian in the Kroger in his attire.
I've gotten recognized from our cooking videos in Kroger before.
Well, the beauty of his talent is he's making all those clothes, which blows me away. I buy mine from vendors, but he actually created. So.
Thank you.
Wow.
It's another rabbit hole once you get going down it. Well, guys, thank you all for coming here tonight. Our wonderful panelists, the audience. This is one of those exciting things I know I get to do at work. It's great. And so we're working on getting the distillery at Locust Grove started back up again. We've got some great projects coming up. Jeffrey just got all our paperwork off to Metro. So as long as they say we're safe, then we're safe. And if you come down there, you're liable to see Alan is down there with us all the time. Steve stops by once in a while. Andrea stops by once in a while. Hopefully we're going to see Fawn out there. I think that'd be great. We've got some other great programs coming up too, like with Susan Rigler and Peggy No on September the 2nd. Look up at our website. They're going to do an afternoon lecture, which is always wonderful. And this has just been the most amazing conversation. It's the greatest crew. There's been a lot of bad with COVID, but we would have never gotten us all together in the same place without having to figure these things out. So thanks to everybody for coming, and watch for that link coming out soon, and we will bid you good night.
Good night and cheers.
Cheers,
to everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Cheers.
night.
Thank you, guys.
All of y'all.
Bye. Thank you.
Night.